Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's reflect upon the fact that every day it appears there are claims and counterclaims about the benefits or the risks of the UK voting to leave the European Union. Which side is making a better fist of it? Has it been a fair fight so far? Joined now by the in-campaigner and former speechwriter for Ed Miliband, that's James Morris, and Tim Collins, who was a speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher, John Major's press secretary as well, before becoming elected as an MP and serving in the shadow cabinet. Gentlemen, a very good morning to both of you. Tim, let's start with you, if we may, as somebody who's coming at this from the Conservative direction. The very idea, the very question that we're positing, is it a fair fight? It was never going to be a fair fight. It was never going to be Queensberry's rules. It was going to be down in the mud, knuckles flying, all the rest of it.
Oh, yeah, I dare say that's true. We also need to bear in mind, of course, that we are still in the part of the campaign where the government is allowed to spend taxpayers' money on the Remain side, and that will be true until Friday of this week. And they have spent many, many millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. One of the interesting things about the opinion polls, which will no doubt come onto it, is that the polls say that people think they've heard more from the Remain side. Well, oh boy, of course they have, because we've all spent £9 million of our taxpayers' money sending a pro-Remain government leaflet to every home and all the rest of it. That will change from Friday. We are really only just entering the real campaign. If you were thinking about this as a general election, we're only really now at the point at which Parliament is being dissolved. There's an awful lot of campaigning, all the TV debates, all the equal part of the campaign where the two sides are allowed to spend the same amount of money to come. And yet, if you certainly look at some of the polls, including today's Times poll, it is very, very close.
That's an interesting point, James, isn't it? That actually Tim's idea that so far, hitherto, we've been fighting a phony war. Ignore all those polls saying it's all finished. The people who are coming up with betting odds saying it's 80% likely that Remain are going to win. Ignore all that, because we're now entering the final straight. All bets are off.
Well, Tim's right that it is like a general election campaign in some respects, and general election campaigns are very rarely decided in the last 4 weeks. They're normally decided years in advance based on the fundamentals, and the fundamentals of the economy are the most important thing in most elections, in most years, in most countries. And the same will be true here, which is that the economy is the issue that the Remain campaign own. There was a period when the Leave campaign were trying to contest it, were trying to say that Britain would do better by forging deals outside the EU. After President Obama's visit, they appeared to give up on that argument and concede when he said we'd be at the back of the queue, that Britain would actually lose out economically from leaving the EU, and that there was certainly a great risk of that. That was the balanced probabilities. We just heard Paul Johnson saying what the economic consensus is. And so now the Leave campaign is being forced onto different turf. They're trying to just fight on the basis of immigration, because that's the issue they've got left.
You look like, Tim, you look like somebody who was tickling under your armpits when Barack Obama was mentioned as the reason that economic argument was lost.
I like Paul Johnson, but he did say he'd looked at 15 surveys, 14 were on the Remain side. He only said he looked at one on the Leave side. I can name you 3 economic studies for a start that actually have said that in the medium to long term the UK economy would benefit greatly by leaving the EU. Andrew Lillico, who actually in many ways was one of the most famous people associated with the Institute of Fiscal Studies, has blogged today saying he thinks the economic impact is probably more likely to be positive than negative, and making the really important point that we keep having this debate in this country as though the European Union is primarily an economic project. It isn't. It's a political project. It's a project to create a country called Europe, a state called Europe. Nobody else in the rest of Europe actually thinks this is predominantly about economics. Well, as we move to talk about the politics, and what James doesn't want to talk about is that immigration is not just something that the Out campaign have plucked from nowhere. It is consistently, over the last 2 or 3 years, the number one issue that the public cite is the thing they are most concerned about. It is an issue on which the Leave side have a tremendous lead, because Remain have no answer to the question, if we stay in, how do we actually stop there being millions, literally millions of people coming into this country, and the pressure that puts on our public services, on our green belt, on our transport and all the rest of it. That is a very powerful campaign issue, and it will be made.
I want to interrupt you, because today actually we're not going to focus on the substantive issues. We're going to focus on the process.
Yeah, sure.
That's the point of our debate today. And I want to come back to the point you were making, James, about Barack Obama. You were saying actually his was a decisive intervention in terms of persuading people that the balance of argument in the economy was heading in one direction. There are lots of other people who say that particular intervention by the president was absolutely symptomatic of the elites talking down, hectoring the ordinary folk of Britain, and actually they feel patronised, they feel patted on the head, and come June the 23rd, they're about to get their own back.
Well, so we did some focus groups in Nuneaton a couple of weeks ago, just after Obama had visited. And so these are swing voters, exactly the kind of people that the Leave campaign need to persuade to come to their side. And what they said was, I don't really like Barack Obama coming over here and telling me my business, but I'm scared by what he says because he is the president of the United States and he is setting out their position. And the polling evidence doesn't show that Barack Obama's intervention was decisive, or Christine Lagarde's, or the IMF, or all the other interventions that have happened in and of themselves. But what has happened over the last few weeks, last month or so, is that the proportion of people saying the economy is their top issue when deciding about the referendum has gone up about 20 points. That's in last week's Commerce poll. And that increase in the salience of the economy is putting the Leave campaign on its back, because it doesn't really have an answer beyond conspiracy theories as to why there is this consensus of views amongst economists, whatever their colour. There are very few studies, and Tim talked about the medium and long-term effect. There is nothing that says there's a short-term benefit from leaving the EU. And so they shift onto immigration, because that's the ground where they do have a lead. Okay. And the question will be over the coming month, and Tim's right to point about the impact of Herder, how does the Remain campaign keep the focus on the economy as the Leave campaign tries to shift onto the kinds of things that Tim was talking about just now?
Look, Tim, you suggested we'll get onto polls. James has introduced the subject, so let's talk about it. You're going to mention the Times poll today, which is saying it's all neck and neck. So let's not focus on that. Let's talk about what Linton Crosby was saying in the Telegraph, I think it was yesterday morning, and saying, well, you know, it was interesting, wasn't it?
So let's ignore the poll that's actually come out that shows the two sides. Linton Crosby was writing on the back of a poll that had a tiny sample, came out with frankly ludicrous conclusions. Those of us who've been out on the doorstep, and it may well be that Remain may or may not win this campaign. They are not going to win because 65 plus voters are going to vote Remain. That is ludicrous, and the poll that said that is frankly laughable. What we do know from the poll today is that by 3-1, to James's point, by 3-1, people don't believe George Osborne's warning that there would be a collapse in house prices, and consistently in the polls by 5-1, people don't believe David Cameron's warning of World War III and the apocalypse. The Remain campaign can't talk positively about the European Union.
Based on individual claims. That isn't the way the campaign works. The way the campaigns work, all campaigns, is that sides generate stories to create a sense and a mood about where the balance of risk is. And each of those things, even though people might not believe the individual fact or the individual claim, creates a sense that leaving is risky. And what you see, if you compare polls like to like, so not just the analysis that Crosby did, there's been a shift amongst Tory voters from being a majority in favour of leaving to being about tide, and that is changing the race.
Sorry, Tim, I'll come back to you in a second.
You're seeing that in two very unreliable phone polls, not general.
Hang on, just before we leave polls, James, let's just focus on your particular experience, bitter experience, I suspect, as a former Ed Miliband advisor, because, hey, polls can be wrong, right? You know from bitter experience that polls can be really wrong, and the chattering classes can really get it wrong. In your heart of hearts, when people say, do you know what? The Brexiteers, they're more motivated to vote. If there's a low turnout, we could all be surprised. Do you entertain those doubts?
Well, look, it is not certain. I mean, it's certainly not certain. So the phone polls have it around 55-45. That isn't a cut and dried result, and there is another month of campaigning to go. But the economy is consistently central to people's voting intentions. People consistently vote to avoid risk rather than seeking out some kind of benefit.
Okay.
So the odds are very strongly, in fact 80%, that Remain are going to win. Now, that's not certainty. You can't have certainty a month out from election day. You only get certainty afterwards. There were big errors in the polls previously, but even with those errors, that's still enough on the phone polls for it to be a Remain lead.
OK, Tim Collins will give you the last word. The phony war's over. What happens next?
Well, first of all, I think we should bear in mind only a year ago, the polls of all sorts were completely wrong. And they were wrong because they underestimated the vote of the Conservative Party and the right of the political spectrum, which is probably on balance more likely to be for Leave than Remain. So let's not just be driven by the polls. There's a long time to go. There's 3 or 4 weeks, plenty of time for people to make their mind up. I think the TV debates will be really, really important. I agree at the moment, I think Remain have got their nose a touch in front, but the complacency that I think we're hearing from a lot of Remain campaigners is putting people off and is very foolish. The public have yet to decide, and it is up to them. It's not actually up to the government.
Tim Collins, James Morris, thanks both very much indeed. Interesting times ahead.